If I ever were to lose you, I'd surely lose myself, and everything I have found, dear, I've not found by myself. Try sometimes and you'll succeed to make this man of me. All my stolen missing parts I've no need for anymore. 'Cause I believe, and I believe 'cause I can see our future days, the days of you and me. The music that's currently playing in the background of this video comes from Igor Stravinsky's neoclassical piece Octet for Wind Instruments. In the middle of his career, following his initial focus on Russian nationalism and neo-primitivism that produced The Rite of Spring, his most famous piece, Stravinsky started using a technique called pastiche to harken back to the old masters in his neoclassical period. This music was written just at the turning point between the modernist and postmodernist eras, and reflects that through its use of pastiche. So, what is pastiche as a technique? To put it simply, it's a technique wherein an artist mimics the style of previous works or periods. Pastiche is distinct from parody in that parody is explicitly sardonic. It's used to mock a pre-existing work or group of works. Pastiche, in contrast, is a loving embrace of the stylistic conventions of a previous work or group of works. Stravinsky's neoclassical period is a perfect example of this, rejecting Romanticism by returning to the conventions of the period that came before it, rather than adhering to the aggressive atonality established by Arnold Schoenberg, his pupils in the New Viennese school, and Stravinsky's own prior work. Pastiche in music was a commonly used technique, particularly during the interval between the two world wars, the transitional period between the modernist era and the postmodernist era. In the case of this specific piece, Stravinsky uses sonata form and a far more tonal approach than his prior work, which baffled his audience at the piece's premiere. Pastiche isn't a technique exclusive to music, though. It's something that happens in all mediums. There are myriad examples of the technique being used across music, literature, drama, film, and yes, of course, video games. I don't think that when The Last of Us was being written, the writers intended it specifically as a work of pastiche, but that is undoubtedly what they've created. A pastiche of zombie media. Noah Gervais' excellent critique of the first game is centered almost entirely around the fact that from start to finish, every narrative and stylistic element in The Last of Us is derived from a previous piece of zombie fiction. Even its basic narrative conceit is admitted by the creators to have been based on The Road, an apocalyptic road trip story by Cormac McCarthy. When it was released, the game was wildly critically and commercially successful, largely because of the touching relationship between its central characters, Joel and Ellie. It was already an extremely critically lauded piece of games media for a decade, until just this year in 2023, it was shot into more mainstream acceptance by the HBO television series adaptation, that had even my grandfather watching. I had initially intended for my video after the Immersive Sim trilogy to be about Mirror's Edge, and I still intend for that to be the next video I make after this one. But I thought that with the show having finished recently, it would be relevant to examine The Last of Us now, and how it interacts with its TV adaptation. I want to explore not only the artistic conventions that go into The Last of Us series, but also my own feelings towards the games, and my more complicated feelings regarding the TV adaptation. It should prove to be an interesting and edifying ride. Let's begin. In my introduction to this video, I discussed the work of Igor Stravinsky as an example of pastiche. Stravinsky, however, was a modernist, and in stark contrast, I think that both The Last of Us titles, and in some ways the franchise's existence as a whole, are distinctly postmodern in different ways. Postmodernism is an artistic and philosophical movement that's oft maligned by the far right, a trend which certainly holds true for both the games and their TV adaptation, and is typically very poorly understood and defined by those who despise it. Pastiche as a technique has been applied to both modernist and postmodernist ideals. For example, Stravinsky's work rejecting Romanticism through an embrace of the classical. Rejection of Romanticism was the paramount objective of the musical modernists, and thus in this case, Stravinsky's use of pastiche supported his modernist objectives. Postmodernism as an artistic movement is much more about the embrace of pastiche for pastiche's sake. In my research for this video, I've read through one of the most influential academic texts regarding postmodernism, that being Frederic Jameson's Postmodernism, or The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. The text was recommended to me by a friend who has a lot more experience engaging with heavy theoretical texts than I do, so I've invited him to collaborate with me on this video to provide a more accessible basic summary of the theory, as well as make sure that I'm not wildly off base in any of my applications of the theory to the works I'll be discussing today. So please, take it away, Sam.
Thanks, Andy. I'll do my best to provide a straightforward explanation of this infamously unexplainable idea. Like with anything, the historical context is very important, and at the risk of sounding a little too much like a poorly written analysis video, which consists of 90% summary, a brief history lesson is in order. Essentially all of contemporary theory and analysis stems from the Age of Enlightenment, which ran from the 1600s to the early 1800s. At least for Western society, this was a period of great social and civil unrest, where the centuries-old structures of feudalism was starting to show some wear and tear. In a rational society where every individual is more or less equal and inherently good, it made no sense that men were born into positions of immense and total power that allowed them to subjugate others. Thinkers of that period would negotiate and arrive at a series of Enlightenment values, which are more or less universally accepted as basic human principles today. Freedom, empiricism, democracy, and equality make up the backbone of most people's worldly understanding, yet all of them are contingent on logic and rationality. The basic and agreeable premise that we should minimize suffering needs to be accepted for these ideas to hold true. This Reddit, for lack of a better term, notion of the world certainly faced criticism and pushback over a variety of artistic and cultural movements. But for understanding postmodernism, cultural modernism, usually understood as spanning the 1890s to early 1940s, is the most important. The rapid growth and industrialization of the mid to late 1800s gave Western society a lot of great things, but it also resulted in global violence on an unprecedented scale. Suddenly, the conquest of non-European nations could be carried out with horrific efficiency, as the potential for technological-driven bloodshed reached historical peaks. This truly atrocious colonialism paired with a burgeoning class consciousness and was crystallized in the conflicts leading up to and including World War I. As a result, a lot of people were given the impression that maybe humans weren't uniquely benevolent creatures. Maybe we were just animals who wanted to commit primal acts like any other beast. Modernism wholeheartedly rejected the optimism of Enlightenment values and the systems that upheld them in a fairly revolutionary way, pushing back against structures of power like religion, nobility, and inherent qualities. Things like the church or the nation were not innately good. Their quality was to be judged by the effects of their actions instead. This is all great stuff, but modernism still did this as a rational critique, simply built on the altered premise that humans were monsters whose every creation bore an innate flaw, rather than perfect creations of God. Everything changed with the Second World War, and specifically the Holocaust. See, fascism is the ultimate rational ideology. Wait a second, hear me out. With a certain set of facts or understandings, authoritarian-led genocides based on constructed identity groups are perfectly logical. If there really did exist a uniquely evil group of people who had no control over their terrible actions and made life objectively worse for all of humanity, then it would make perfect sense that they probably shouldn't exist. The issue, of course, is that systemic genocide committed by the Nazis was born in no truth. Its logical justification simply based on millennia-old bigotries and fabricated scientific conclusions. Using the narrative of facts and logic, Germany was able to construct its own version of history that placed Jewish people as the unambiguous villain and justify any sort of atrocity committed against them. For the early postmodernists, this was enough to question the Enlightenment values which had governed modern society for so long. For me personally, it's helpful to understand postmodernism as this initial realization in the fallibility of logic and rationality as narratives, or fundamental modes of understanding the world, followed by the realization that then all of our narratives, or histories, or truths, are fabricated, and thus untrue. To put it bluntly, postmodernism is simply the idea that nothing is true, extending as far as reality itself. Alright, bold and very confusing claim, I know, but let's clarify. If modernism gives us the idea that nothing has an innate value, we merely apply our own notions of language onto everything, then postmodernism takes it a step further and recognizes that even these own concepts we create have no inherent properties, and we can only understand them through references to each other. Take this chair, for example. You and I would probably agree that this is indeed a chair. But what does the word chair convey other than a concept of essential cherishness? What even is an essential cherishness? But something we know as the lack of non-chair characteristics. How do we know what those are? Why do we know what those are? This might seem reductive, but aside from a reference to the culturally agreed upon notion of a chair, what is the inherent value of the word chair? The logical conclusion would thus be that nothing defines chair aside from a linguistic reference that English speakers agree upon. But if different cultures provide different agreed upon notions of facts and historical narratives as well as language, then how can we recognize that any of our history is real and not produced by a biased agreed upon concept? How can we even engage in reality if the history it's built upon never existed? This is not to say that things do not happen and events do not affect people. That's pretty obviously untrue. Merely that our very conceptions of reality are built on shared history and knowledge. But if those very conceptions are constructed and based on cultural notions themselves, then there is no reality that exists. See, all of us belong to an unknowable, large amount of cultures and backgrounds, the combination of which is unique to every individual. Other people might be some combination of American, Jewish, Eastern European, guitar player, grad student, video game analyst, and whatever cavalcade of specific identity characteristics related to my own personal cultural background. My traditional American notion of what occurred during the 20th century might directly conflict with my Jewish history, and my positionality as a Magic the Gathering player might contradict certain aspects of both of them. When viewed in entirety, the combination of life experience and cultural background which I occupy is entirely unique to me, so my notion of a broader historical narrative is only real to me. I cannot properly engage with history and the reality it merely represents, and this is true for literally everyone. This might appear to be a worldview-shattering revelation, but for postmodernism, it's merely a function of contemporary society. See, everything we experience or conceptualize is in a sense a simulation of an unreachable historical reality. We don't actually engage in some abstract notion of truth. We only engage with simulacra, or symbols which point towards an impossible truth which we can never share. Any grand narrative or universal understanding of literally anything has no value, and we can only engage in this false reality through representations that point towards fragmented aspects of it. The point of this entire methodology or mode of critique is nebulous at best, and once you give yourself over to this post-structuralist, postmodern worldview, it becomes profoundly sad. That's not the goal of this ultimate deconstruction, to blackpill us into boring Rick Sanchez parodies. It's to merely point out the constructed nature of reality, and to hopefully highlight the importance of aesthetic experience. See, if we cannot intellectualize anything in good faith, or from a similar theoretical historical framework, then maybe the intangible is now more valuable than our outdated notions of the tangible. This is where postmodern and contemporary theory turns to the power of the unknown in the aesthetic experience. The joy or catharsis, and alternatively the pain or sadness I feel when I do uniquely human activities, then, are more important, or at least more emblematic of reality in life itself, than any biased conceptualizations born from a perceived false logic or reason. We may not be able to understand anything about the world, or our lives and how they function, but we can feel powerful emotional responses to certain things, and maybe that's worth something in itself. In summary, postmodernism is the ultimate response to the logic of Enlightenment values. It recognizes that placing innate value in anything like logic and rationality will inevitably result in totalitarianism. The response is to recognize that literally everything, including history and reality itself, is constructed and negotiated based on cultural factors. We can never know the experience of literally anybody or anything but ourselves. We can only convey meaning and experience reality through the emotional responses prompted by simulacra of another's lived experience. Nothing is true, not even reality itself, but feelings and bodily responses do impact us. Wow, that was a doozy, even for me. It's incredibly difficult to articulate or simplify these theoretical ideas, and I hope this provides something of use which can inform the rest of Andy's analysis. Back to you, Chief.
Wow. Nazis, critique of liberal market economies, and praise of The Last of Us Part 2 in one video. This project is sure to encounter a great deal of intelligent and good faith critique. I can't wait to see the comments bitching about how you can't apply real-world politics to these stories about post-apocalyptic fascism, revolutionary violence, the reconstruction of functional society after a pandemic, war, abusive religion, genocide, and medical and parental ethics. In any case, an excellent summation of the basic ideas and cultural context behind postmodern theory. Thanks, Sam. Full disclosure, I think that if it's not obvious by now, it'll quickly become apparent that I put some stock in post-structuralist philosophy. Ironically, I think there's some truth to the idea that objectivity doesn't really exist in the way that we perceive the world. That said, this video kind of hinges on putting some stock into that idea, so mileage is going to vary greatly with the ideas presented here. I don't think that there's any objective way to view a piece of art, so I can only really engage with it through my own specific lens and the lenses of other people that I agree with. You have a different lens, but I hope that by the end of this video, it's a little more similar to mine. I also want to stress that while I have a passing knowledge of this philosophy from my own education and research, I'm not an expert. There may be blind spots or errors in my application of the philosophy, and I welcome people who are more knowledgeable on the subject to correct or expand upon the ideas presented in the comments. We're going to get deeper into the weeds using the book pretty quickly, so if you want to go read it for yourself, feel free to pause this video, go purchase a digital or hard copy, spend 15 to 20 hours reading a dense text on postmodern theory, and then come back to the video. Or you could, just listen along to this comparatively much shorter and more entertaining video. From the outset, the mass popularity of post-apocalyptic fiction is almost intrinsically tied to the rise of the postmodern movement. Certainly the moderns engaged with ideas of the end of life as we know it, but with the end of World War II and the rise of the Cold War, something about the global climate caused a massive increase in the prevalence of post-apocalyptic fiction. Although I just can't quite put my finger on what. Oh, right! The invention of the RCA synthesizer!
This is music with a strictly electronic beat.
The RCA brought with it a constant threat of annihilation that influenced the cultural consciousness in a massive way. Seriously, ask anybody who grew up during the Cold War, and they'll tell you that the threat of nuclear apocalypse was pretty much always in the back of their mind. This naturally wound up leading to a much greater prevalence of fiction concerning the death of human society. Fiction regarding a nuclear apocalypse was and is such a prevalent genre that it has its own separate Wikipedia page enumerating dozens of pieces of media from 1950 to today. This sword of Damocles, however, wasn't the only thing affecting the cultural consciousness during the latter half of the 20th century. The Cold War also brought with it a conflict of ideologies, a battle between imperialist liberal capitalism and imperialist state capitalism, commonly referred to by the general public as communism or socialism, despite the fact that the Soviet Union followed basically none of the tenets of either of those political ideologies. Obviously, in the end, imperialist liberal capitalism won out, leading to the society that we know today. But it's this global cultural conflict, mixed with the constant threat of nuclear apocalypse, that birthed the modern conception of the zombie. It's pretty much inarguable that the popular conception of the zombie traces its origins back to George Romero's Dead films. The first two of which are Vietnam-era metaphorical critiques of Cold War paranoia and imperialist liberal capitalism, particularly Dawn of the Dead with its semi-comedic depiction of the zombies as brain-dead consumers, both literally and figuratively. Over time, this allegorical significance that the zombie held was diluted further and further until they became a standard fare movie monster. The zombie is a great and enduring horror media villain for a few reasons. Firstly, as George Romero himself puts it, they're us. Zombies carry with them the innate horror that they're a corruption of the human form that is indiscriminate. You could become one, your loved ones could become one, and all it takes is one bite, or sometimes, in the case of The Last of Us, one misplaced breath. No matter how long the zombie has existed, or how many ways they're presented, this has remained their most fundamental horrific attribute, and a constant source of pathos. Secondly, they're wholly irrational actors. There's no reasoning with a zombie. They're essentially animals driven by the primal impulse to violently consume. If you're stuck with one, the only way out is through violent confrontation or tense, nail-biting stealth. Thirdly, the zombie allows audiences to engage with extreme gore and violence guilt-free, since brutally killing a zombie carries with it no moral weight. As I said in point number 2, zombies are wholly irrational actors and will always attack a human on sight, making violence against them inherently an act of self-defense, whether proactive or reactive. So what about this cultural context and these genre conventions all fits in with postmodern theory? Well, what's probably the most surface-level fact is that the post-apocalyptic genre grew up alongside postmodern theory. This seems like it wouldn't actually say much, but Jameson describes postmodernism as less of a coherent artistic movement and more of a historical period or cultural moment. So the fact that post-apocalyptic and zombie fiction as we know it today came to exist at this specific moment in time is directly relevant and ties it to the cultural context that Jameson is writing about in the book. Jameson also writes the following in his introduction, quote, "Something marked by a new term, with its vague, ominous, or exhilarating promise to get rid of whatever you found confining, unsatisfying, or boring about the modernism, or modernity. In other words, a very modest or mild apocalypse, the merest sea breeze that has the additional advantage of already having taken place." End quote. This passage is not discussing a literal apocalypse, but rather what made postmodern theory attractive as a way of viewing the world. While it's not directly related to an actual apocalypse, I do think that this idea informs pretty much all of post-apocalyptic fiction. While post-apocalyptic worlds are almost universally horrible places to live in when compared to our own, it's undeniable that we have a certain fascination with them. I think this is because they represent a complete destruction of the mundanity that we plod through every day. We live our lives within a strict system of socioeconomic rules of law, of capitalism, and of social expectation. Apocalypse promises freedom from those rules, much in the same way that postmodern philosophy promises freedom from the purported objective truth of modernism. There's a reason why far-right, libertarian types are often associated with an obsession with preparation for the apocalypse. They find themselves in a world with an established hierarchy, one whose rules bind them. What right-wingers call libertarianism is fundamentally concerned with climbing your way to the top of that hierarchy, at the expense of all those around you. And apocalypse dissolving the rules of the current hierarchy would provide the opportunity to seize power over the new one, hence the prepper's fantasy. It's not hard to draw an association between our cultural fascination with the apocalypse and a desire to be free of the yoke of late-stage capitalism. With the rise of the Cold War, and then again after the fall of the Soviet Union, a certain idea referred to as the end of history became very popular in the West. The phrase was originally coined in the 1860s, but as it adapts to mid to late 20th century America, the phrase references a philosophy where liberal market economies began to allow themselves to believe, or at least began to promote the idea, that they represented some sort of final stage of socioeconomic evolution, the pinnacle of development of human society. Americans are indoctrinated with this idea from birth, the whole socialism sounds great on paper but mentality. It's even present in our public schools, wherein liberalism is directly presented as the only viable form of socioeconomic organization. Post-apocalyptic fiction is, in a way, both a critique and an embrace of this very idea, or perhaps a way to give voice to the niggling doubt that exists in all people's minds that, despite how strong and infinite it may seem, the Empire can always be toppled, whether that be by a nuclear bomb or by the emergence of fungus zombies. It plays into the idea by presenting what comes after the fall of liberal capitalism's domination as always being inherently worse or catastrophic when compared to the society ruled by a liberal market economy. Yet, simultaneously, to suggest that the Empire can fall at all is counter to the narrative of liberal capitalism's perfection. This is a big part of what makes examining media through a postmodern lens so frustrating. Post-structuralist theory often leads to works voicing multiple, sometimes even contradictory perspectives. There's never one true, correct, or objective way of analyzing a piece of media, or even a real-world situation, an idea that The Last of Us Part 2 will make one of its core themes. I bring up all these socioeconomic implications of post-apocalyptic media because The Last of Us series will engage with pretty much all of them in different ways at different times. As I've said already, the original Last of Us is a pastiche of zombie media, and most, if not all, the concepts and ideas that it represents have been presented before. When Sam gets infected in Pittsburgh, that moment traces its origins all the way back to Night of the Living Dead itself in this scene. The things that the original Last of Us draws from other pieces of zombie media don't end there, though. It lifts the iconic "Don't Open Dead Inside" graffiti from the Walking Dead TV series, and Joel hailing from the Deep South is certainly evocative of Rick Grimes. David and his cannibal tribe have appeared in more pieces of post-apocalyptic media than you can count, including The Road. The game then naturally interacts with a lot of the same thematic and philosophical ideas that those previous works did. This repackaging of old ideas is one of the main reasons why I consider the original Last of Us to be a deeply postmodern work. It just so happens that in the case of The Last of Us, the new packaging adds something new to the experience and perception of those repackaged ideas: interactivity. I often hear people act as though the interactive nature of The Last of Us is an ancillary or unnecessary part of the experience, and I couldn't disagree more. While the gameplay is certainly minimalistic, the very fact that you, the player, are directing the protagonist through the world fundamentally changes the way you relate to the story and its characters, whether your actions change those things or not. In TV or movies, there's always a layer of abstraction between the viewer and the characters. When we watch a piece of passive media, we can much more easily judge the character's actions as an outside observer. Both The Last of Us games, to me, are an exploration of just how much the interactive nature of video games as a medium can shift our perception of a story, in the case of the first game accidentally, and then in the case of the second game deliberately. When we play a video game, we begin to map ourselves onto the protagonist by virtue of the fact that we guide them through their role. This is the phenomenon that's always allowed games to be far more emotionally effective with far less narrative content when compared to passive media. I mean, look at how attached people become to characters like Gordon Freeman, a character who never speaks and is only barely characterized by the words of the people around him. A massive number of people still have a notable emotional connection, despite the fact that Gordon is basically a camera, a gun, and not much else. In The Last of Us, when Joel hides from a threat, part of the brain, however small, tells us that we are hiding from a threat as well. When Joel gets stabbed, part of the brain tells us that we've been stabbed. And when Joel kills, part of the brain tells us that we have killed. This loosening of the barrier between Joel's identity and our own is what leads to his and Ellie's relationship and journey feeling real and personal, despite the fact that what they're going through is mostly stuff that we've seen before. None of this is to say that The Last of Us' status as a work of pastiche is a bad thing. In fact, it's another big part of what makes the game so emotionally effective. What's old is the trappings, the zombies, the basic twists and turns of the plot. We've seen those before, and so the game, rightfully, doesn't make those things its main focus. The zombie apocalypse instead serves as a familiar backdrop and a source of tension that can be applied to the story's real focus, that being the relationship between its two major characters. I think the other thing that makes the original Last of Us feel very postmodern is its narrative structure. Jameson, when discussing the postmodern movement, talks about how the works produced in the postmodern era focus less on the results of actions and more on moments of change. The Last of Us, as a narrative, is fundamentally concerned with moments of change. What it boils down to is a series of vignettes along Joel and Ellie's transcontinental road trip, each one concerning a major moment of change in their relationship. I'd like to discuss each of those moments and talk through the game from beginning to end, to make sure that we're getting the full picture. Through this process, I'll try to dissect not only the relationship between our two central characters, but also the pastiche that The Last of Us is, and how it leverages its medium to produce its particular emotional effect. The first moment of change The Last of Us examines is the big one itself. The day that everything changed, so to speak. This prologue chapter is an iconic part of the game, and with good reason. Despite being a segment of gameplay that features no interactive elements outside of the character's movement, The Last of Us's Outbreak Day sequence still manages to feel deeply chaotic and intense. It's notable that even when the gameplay is at its least interactive, a degree of cinematographic control is still given to the player. There's a sequence where Sarah, your point-of-view character for the first few minutes of play, gets in the back of Joel's car, while the family tries to get out of the city. And even in this period where your player character is only sitting in the back of a truck, you still control the camera. When you pass by the desperate family on the road or the flaming barn, whether or not Sarah looks at them is your choice. It's an extremely small degree of player input, but it still serves to facilitate that identity grafting effect, moving the experience from what would be a third-person one in a piece of passive media to a first-person one. Then the car crashes, and with just one cut, our perspective is moved from Sarah's to Joel's. Our point of view is completely shifted in seconds, and the process of identity grafting begins again, though this time it'll be one that's much more long-term. Now we as Joel run through the carnage and fire past the ravenous hordes of infected and are able to do nothing but carry our helpless, injured daughter. They make it to the bridge out of the city, only to have the soldier guarding the way ordered to execute them. He misses Joel, but Sarah is tragically, if predictably, killed. This opening is excellent, and it serves a few very important purposes. Firstly, it bonds us to Joel and the world directly through both a collective and personal trauma. We physically guided Joel through the original outbreak itself, so on some level the brain tells us that we've now experienced the trauma of Outbreak Day, and we'll carry that with us throughout the rest of this game and the next one. Every time someone talks about the initial outbreak, we now have both the literal and experiential context to understand exactly what it was like to be alive on that day. Then there's the personal aspect, the death of Sarah. Sarah has only existed in the story for what totals to be about 15 or 20 minutes, and yet during this time we've had a few minutes to map ourselves onto both her and her father, and then seen her brutally and callously killed. We're directed to graft some part of Joel's trauma onto ourselves, because we've controlled him leading up to this point. You may not have noticed it, but your brain did. The second important aspect of this opening vignette is its minimalist gameplay. As I said a few moments ago, at no point in this opening does the player engage with the world beyond just walking through it, and yet a small degree of interactivity has begun the all-important process of identity grafting. We've started to identify with both Sarah and Joel directly, and therefore have been primed to feel the impact of Sarah's death, despite the brevity of the game's opening sequence. The fact that the player characters are helpless also forces us to rely directly on an NPC, Tommy, who at a few different points saves us from a zombie or the imminent threat of death. This is one of The Last of Us's favorite tricks for bonding us to NPCs, and it'll be expanded upon in other ways soon, but I'll talk about those when they become more directly relevant. Thirdly, and most importantly, it sets up the structure for the entire story, the focus on moments of change. This opening vignette features not one, not two, but a whopping 7 moments of change for both the characters and our experience of the setting. We begin with Sarah and Joel living happily, only to have that disrupted within minutes by the initial outbreak. Moment 1. Then, shortly after, Sarah and Joel's infected neighbor breaks into their home and Joel kills him. The first act of violence against a zombie. Moment 2. The car crashes and breaks Sarah's leg, leading to the aforementioned perspective shift. A metatextual moment of change, but moment 3 nonetheless. Then there's the soldier ordered to execute Sarah and Joel. Our trust in authority and other humans, writ broadly, is eroded in moment 4. Tommy kills the soldier in the first act of violence against another human. That's moment 5. Sarah dies in Joel's arms in moment 6, and then immediately after we cut to 20 years later in moment 7. The framing of those last 2 moments is important, and part of what feels particularly postmodern about the structure of The Last of Us. Once the most severe and personal of the opening's moments of change has happened, the narrative shifts to its next vignette immediately, and with no regard for what happens to Joel afterward. The next 20 years of history are conveyed in nothing but a brief opening credits sequence that focuses itself only on a few major moments of change within the setting. While historically speaking, the most important thing that happened was the outbreak, In Joel's personal subjective narrative, and therefore the player's personal narrative, the death of Sarah overshadows all of that history and collective trauma, and therefore it's presented as nothing but a blur. So not only are we seeing the game emphasize moments of change as its narrative focus, but specifically those moments of change most important to our point of view characters' specific, subjective experience of the world. If this is all starting to sound a bit like that summary of postmodernism that Sam gave earlier, that's the point. After the 20-year time skip, The Last of Us jumps right into its next major moment of change, as well as what I think is the most novel aspect of its post-apocalyptic society. The vast majority of zombie media depicts the outbreak as the end of all civilized society. The Last of Us, in contrast, imagines the US government transitioning into a military dictatorship, with control over a series of quarantine zones across the country. Instead of complete disarray, there's a new, worse order, which I do find to be a more realistic way things would probably go in the face of something like the cordyceps brain infection. This vignette is chiefly concerned with establishing the game's new setting and tutorializing the gameplay, and thus devotes most of its time to giving players a brief tour around the QZ, and the life that Joel and his companion Tess lead. But even here, we have the next big change, that being Joel and Ellie's first meeting. I think it's notable that the game doesn't really spend any time in its status quo before upsetting it. Joel is literally woken up by Tess calling him on the job that will change everything for both of them. And so, by the time we're in control of Joel again, we're already on an unstoppable collision course with the Fireflies, Marlene, and of course, Ellie. This first and longest vignette also introduces us to how the Last of Us series will structure its gameplay segments, and weirdly enough, on my most recent playthrough I found myself having strong flashbacks to Remedy Entertainment's 2010 release, Alan Wake. I can't believe that I had never noticed this before, since that game was a core fixation of mine during my tween years. But The Last of Us and Alan Wake's gameplay pacing are actually surprisingly similar in terms of the way they imply distance traveled. For those who haven't played it, Alan Wake is a game that often involves hiking through the woods, and the game will always begin a given leg of gameplay with the player overlooking their destination from afar. They'll then descend into the woods and get lost in the dark and the flora and the taken until they eventually arrive at that destination. With this technique, the game implies a much greater distance traveled than the player actually experiences. Both of the Last of Us titles pull this exact same perspective-shifting trick in pretty much every leg of their stories to remarkable effect, though this time to insinuate more of a road trip experience than Nordic walking. The Alan Wake comparison is actually more apt than one might expect, too. Both The Last of Us and Alan Wake are games that utilize basic third-person shooter mechanics and are deeply concerned with aping the style of prestige television. Although, Alan Wake has a much more specific affinity for Twin Peaks and the works of Stephen King, whereas The Last of Us is more concerned with zombie media writ broadly. The zombies themselves are the other major thing that's pretty novel about The Last of Us titles, and this first vignette takes a considerable amount of time to introduce them to us. Rather than leaning into the classic ghoul that was popularized by Night of the Living Dead and utilized in most subsequent pieces of zombie media, The Last of Us instead opts to create its own unique and in-depth fungus zombie ecology. I think this move specifically helped to cement the series in the cultural consciousness, because the various stages of CBI, but particularly the clicker, are all unforgettable and very iconic. The fungus zombie aesthetic gives The Last of Us a specific and unique visual identity that helps to make it feel like it's a lot more original and unique as a work than it actually is. Once you've seen a clicker, you'll never forget the striking image of the grotesque fungal growths over its eyes and body, or the strange, inhuman sounds they make in a stealth arena. After the bombed-out skyscraper set piece in downtown Boston, the setting and the world for the rest of the game have been established. The basic combat and stealth mechanics have been tutorialized, and the gameplay pacing has been set. It's at this point that The Last of Us pivots away from focusing on its world and towards the more character-driven story that will be its main focus. Along with this pivot of focus comes a return to the pastiche that The Last of Us is at its core. Be honest, when you first met Tess, you didn't seriously expect her to live, did you? The early major character death by infection is such a tried and true zombie trope that when I began playing the game it felt like a foregone conclusion. From here on out, each vignette will guide Joel and Ellie through a given classic zombie media set piece, and use that to test and change their relationship. This here is the moment of change that the second vignette has been building to over its extended runtime. While Joel and Ellie meeting was the moment of the first half, Tess's infection and death solidifies not only the fact that Joel will have to schlep Ellie across America, but also roots their relationship with one another in shared trauma. Vignette 3 focuses itself on the isolated doomsday prepper concept, but leverages it not only as a warning sign for Joel as a character, but as a way of facilitating the next change in Joel and Ellie's relationship, that being their acceptance of one another as companions. It also introduces us to one of the other interesting things about The Last of Us's pacing, the scavenging loop. The game features a great deal of downtime where the two characters are traveling through the streets of Lincoln, Mass., during which smaller, more granular moments of change play out. Optional conversations regarding different pieces of old-world media like the Mortal Kombat-esque arcade cabinet, or artifacts of the collapse, serve as miniature change points where Joel and Ellie inch a little closer to one another and open up, even if it's just a tiny bit. Critics of the series often complain about The Last of Us titles being brain-dead crafting loop games, but the resource scavenging loops here are critical to the narrative objectives of the titles. While you scavenge, the character writing is given time to shine, and we get smaller, subtler moments of change in our core relationship that help sell the bigger ones. It's also during these periods of downtime and scavenging that the process of identity grafting is happening most actively. Any time when we're alone with our own thoughts and simply guiding Joel through the world is the time during which our identity as the player can become conflated with that of the protagonist. It's in these periods of downtime where you start to have thoughts that are I statements. Things like, if I could just find a few more rags, or have I already explored that building, or am I going the right way? These thoughts are that process of identity grafting in action, slowly dissolving the walls between player and protagonist, inch by inch. The Last of Us also uses interactivity in these periods of exploration to facilitate player affinity with NPC companions. I mentioned this briefly when talking about the prologue, but The Last of Us will frequently have these little sections of teamwork between player character and NPC. These little moments of teamwork are meant to facilitate a greater degree of attachment between the player and those non-playable characters. For example, the most common of these is the boosting mechanic, which sees Joel boost Ellie or another NPC up to a high ledge, and then have that character help him climb up with them. Critics also miss the point here, I think. I've heard people describe the sections where Joel is asked to grab a pallet for Ellie to ride on as puzzles with no challenge, but that's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of why those set pieces exist in the first place. This is a problem within the gaming community that I've talked about before, but a lot of people seem to view presenting a challenge as the only reason why a given element might exist in a game. The pallet riding sections aren't there to present you with a challenge. They're there to get you to feel like Ellie the NPC is depending on you, in a way similar to how you depend on her when the game uses the boost mechanic. Without each other, there's no way that Ellie or Joel would be able to cross any given level, let alone the entire country. These third and fourth vignettes in Billstown and Pittsburgh, respectively, are where The Last of Us's status as a pastiche is at its most noticeable. It's down to the point where some lines of dialogue, particularly those from Bill, are things that have been said hundreds of times over in different pieces of zombie media. The prepper loner character trope is so common that I even mentioned it earlier when I was talking about post-apocalyptic fiction generally, and the human raider band is a similarly widely recognized trope. It's in the Pittsburgh arc where the Don't Open Dead Inside homage and the classic innocent kid gets infected plot beats happen as well. Again, these concepts are present to apply pressure to our central relationship. The reason these specific plot beats are such common tropes is because they work. They're a tried and true method of producing pathos and ratcheting up tension in a zombie apocalypse setting. Billstown and Pittsburgh together serve as bonding mechanisms for Joel and Ellie. Through two major struggles, first against infected and then against other people, the two have to learn to trust each other with their lives and become true comrades rather than just companions. A change which only feels real because of the intensely high stakes created by these two post-apocalyptic cliches. It may sound like I'm deriding the game for being predictable, but I'm not at all. The Last of Us has a certain earnestness to its presentation that's almost impossible not to get wrapped up in if you're playing attentively. The performances of Troy Baker, Ashley Johnson, and the entire supporting cast are extremely convincing, even when you see every major story beat coming from a mile away. And the quality of the dialogue is for the most part high enough, and the central relationship believable enough, that you don't get bogged down in thinking about how many times you've seen this idea presented before. Jackson is where our central relationship begins to move from the cooperative to the truly emotional, and it features one of the game's most iconic scenes for this exact reason. There's a brief aside at the hydroelectric dam that serves to power Jackson before Ellie makes a break for it, and honestly I think this section is one that could have done with being entirely combat-free. I was more than content just walking around with Tommy, learning a bit more about his society and the Miller family, and the combat sections actually felt like they were detracting from the delivery of the story here. Tommy's group represents something of a way forward for humanity. They're the first real society that we've seen since leaving the quarantine zone, and it honestly seems like life is pretty good. They've got power, food, hell, the kids even get to watch movies. The presence of Jackson makes prominent a secondary theme that I also find to be distinctly postmodern. The Fireflies and their mission to find the cure is a definitively backward-looking solution. The Fireflies look to the old world and think, God, I wish we could get back there again. A world where, yes, everyone was more comfortable than they are now, but also constantly exploited. In contrast, Jackson is a fully functional socialist community, a concept that will be expanded upon later in the second game in the TV show. Rather than idolizing the past, the Jackson settlement is adapting and looking forward, making real, tangible socioeconomic progress, perhaps even moving past what the old world is capable of. This is where that discussion of the end of history becomes really relevant to The Last of Us. That dichotomy between resentment for the present world, here presented by Jackson, and nostalgia for it, as presented by the Fireflies, is core to the game's secondary thematic conflict. Joel and Ellie's emotional reconciliation here is a particularly important moment of change in a game focused on them. There's a very iconic scene after Ellie makes a break for it where the two of them have a brutal falling out. And I want to highlight it specifically because I think it's scenes like this that give The Last of Us its power as a story.
Told me about Sarah.
Ellie?
And
You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
I'm sorry about your daughter, Joel, but I have lost people too.
You have no idea what loss is.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you. So don't tell me that I would be safer with someone else, because the truth is I would just be more scared.
You're right. You're not my daughter. And I sure as hell ain't your dad.
Say what you will about the game's status as Pastiche and its minimalist gameplay, but emotional moments like this hit so hard and stick in your memory precisely because of the relationship that we have to these characters as a player. Certainly the voice acting and dialogue writing are pulling a lot of weight, but it's because we've directly experienced not only the journey thus far, but also Joel's own deep trauma alongside him that we can truly feel what he's feeling in this moment, and deeply understand his contradictory desires to push Ellie away and let her in. It's hard to just explain this without having experienced the game directly, but I think anybody who has will completely understand what I mean here. Once you've experienced this segment, it makes it all the more believable when the university chapter opens like this.
What about you? What'd you want to be?
Well, when I was a kid, I used to want to be a singer.
Shut up.
No, serious.
Sing something.
No,
Come on, I won't laugh.
I don't think so.
Joel, please.
The university chapter is another point in the story where we have multiple big-ticket changes occurring, and it creates an interesting effect. The first change is the one I just highlighted. Joel is officially opening up to Ellie. He's telling her about his life and his dreams, even. The two seem to have finally truly bonded, and it's honestly and unironically heartwarming. As you explore the science building, however, you have the rug pulled out from under this new status quo not once, but twice. Firstly with the reveal that the Fireflies have moved and you'll be trekking to Utah, and secondly with Joel's injury. Towards the end of the chapter, Joel gets pushed off a balcony onto a rebar spike. This scene is particularly brutal, and I do think that's largely again because of the game's interactive nature breaking down the barriers between Joel's identity and our own. I consume a great deal of very violent media, and tend to have no issue with blood and gore. And yet, every time I reach this scene in the game, I actively cringe upon Joel's impact with the spike. Obviously this is only anecdotal, but to me, another point of evidence in favor of the storytelling power of gameplay. Some part of me, when I watch this cutscene, feels as though I've been stabbed, even though I'm only watching a very detailed system of pixels on a screen. I want to take a quick break from the main story and talk about the original game's DLC, Left Behind. For the purposes of this video, I actually played Left Behind right here, where it canonically takes place. It does break with the game in that it's not a moment of change for our central relationship per se, but more of a change for Ellie as a character, as well as a time to delve into her backstory. Left Behind sees us play as Ellie in both the present, searching for medical supplies to save Joel's life, and the past, the day Ellie was bitten. The main story in the present day is a compelling, if accelerated, origin story for the Ellie that we see in the next major vignette. You'll go from stealthily killing one infected to slaughtering dozens of men before the campaign's through, and despite the fact that Ellie has never had to engage in combat on this scale alone, it's still weirdly believable, because for the most part the game slowly ticks up that tension dial from 0 to 100. It starts with, as I said, killing only one infected and some light exploration, but then pits you against a group of stalkers, a small group of humans with some infected, and then a big all-out brawl at the end, which features 14-year-old Ellie sneaking around slaughtering grown men like fucking Rambo. This is actually a perfect example of something important that I haven't talked about yet, the heightened reality that The Last of Us takes place in. People mischaracterize The Last of Us as a realistic and grounded zombie apocalypse story, and I don't think this could be further from the truth. It's certainly dark, but being dark doesn't necessarily translate to realism. If the game was realistic, you'd never engage with more than one enemy at a time without dying. No, instead, The Last of Us as a series is more concerned with the emotional effect of its story, and to that end, reality is malleable. Why is Joel a superhuman killing machine? Well, partially because he's the protagonist in a video game and combat is necessitated. But the game engages with that fact and leverages it to draw a portrait of Joel as a man to be feared, a man who's unstable and will go to the most extreme lengths possible to save those he loves. Why is it that a 14-year-old girl with very little actual practical experience can become the main character in Ellie First Blood? The emotional impact and the character arc. This all starts to get at a broader white whale of mine and artistic critique, but we'll discuss that more when talking about the TV show. Left Behind also engages with some of the ideas of postmodern theory we've discussed in some ways that I don't think were intentional, but I do think are very interesting. Both stories take place in malls, which are relics even now, but play into the weird dichotomy that we've talked about a few times regarding how post-apocalyptic fiction engages with the end of history myth. This is true of the main game as well to an extent, but Left Behind is particularly obsessed with signifiers of our present-day world. Jameson talks a lot about how the market has supplanted culture in our post-industrial world, and Left Behind's choice to set its story in these locations is a direct representation of that idea. How are we going to make a story that's nostalgic for the old world? Well, we'll set it in a mall, a monument to capitalism and conspicuous consumption. Somehow we're 20 years into the apocalypse, and we're still finding ways to participate in commodity fetishization. The mall standing as a symbol of pre-outbreak culture is interesting in another way. Even by 2013, when The Last of Us first released, malls hadn't been a central pillar of the American economy for probably a decade. There's a concept called the retail apocalypse that had been slowly taking place since the 1990s and has since come to full fruition with the rise of Amazon and other online storefronts. There's an entire chapter in Jameson's book called Nostalgia for the Present, and I think that chapter applies to Left Behind very heavily. In the chapter, Jameson essentially posits that all of our conceptions of historical periods, including the present, are informed more by the myths that those periods tell about themselves rather than the actual material reality of those historical periods. He raises the example of the way that Americans perceive the 1950s, being more informed by the stories that the media of the time told about the period, but I would raise Left Behind as a perfect example of this happening in real time. Despite the fact that malls are a dead concept in the present day, and even at the time the DLC was created, they're still being used to represent that time period. Perhaps because of a bias that the mall was core to Neil Druckmann's youth, or because it could be used as a loose simulacrum for American culture writ broadly, a cesspool of brand identity and advertisements performing its best impression of a culture. It's notable that Riley presents the mall to Ellie as a lost wonder of the world, literally using that phrasing as the two tour the building. In playing Left Behind, I really can't help but feel like I'm living out a nostalgia film for not only the last night of Ellie's normal life, but Neil Druckmann's teenage years after he moved to the US in 1989. Ironically, here too we return to the world of zombie Pastiche, only this time it's less Night of the Living Dead and more Dawn of the Dead. That film was also set in a mall, but its core conceit was ironically mocking American consumerist culture by comparing the zombies' lust for human flesh to our own lust for shiny new shit. Here, the satire at the heart of Dawn of the Dead has been completely eroded by The Last of Us's earnest presentation. There's not even a drop of irony in the ways that Left Behind interacts with either its setting or its tired coming-of-age tropes, and yet, for some reason, the DLC as an experience still worked for me. I think this is because of the attachment I'd developed with Ellie as Joel. Here we, having played mostly as Joel up to this point, get to experience Ellie's little stand-by-me moment from the perspective of someone else who is intimately familiar with her, and so the tropes still read despite the fact that they're so overdone. It's the main game's winter vignette that takes Ellie into some slightly more novel character territory without abandoning the game's core pastiche with the previously mentioned cannibal tribe. I also think it's here that the game's Western vibes are most heavily on display. If you drop out the cannibalism, this chapter absolutely feels like something that might happen in a Western. A harsh winter. Pa's sick. Gotta hunt, stay alive, maybe get him some medicine from the next town over. All of The Last of Us is very mired in a certain Americanism, with Joel's Deep South affect being a constant reminder, but also the genres that it borrows from. Modern zombie fiction has its origins in 20th century American culture. The Western is the most distinctly American genre there is, even if a lot of them were shot in Italy. Coming-of-age stories are extremely popular in America. This winter vignette combines all of these concepts relatively deftly. During this chapter, the game tries to pull its NPC trust-building trick with its main villain, David, but here I don't think it works anywhere near as well. There's a huge set piece where Ellie and David fend off a massive horde of infected that's pretty clearly supposed to build some trust between the player and David, so that the reveal that he's a cannibal PDF file will still hit. I think the problem is the reason why the technique is being used here. Most of the time, the trust-building activities are taking place in the background of scavenging or combat, being used to subtly influence you to identify with the relationship that doesn't actually exist. Here, they're instead being used to paper over a trope in a story that's already been full of them without even an attempt to lampshade them. If they wanted this to work, I think they really would have needed to delay the reveal of David's true nature much longer. But then, that would be devastating to the vignette's pacing. I've heard a few people, including my previously mentioned influence Noah Gervais, talk about how this vignette is sexist and undermines Ellie's character arc, and I strongly disagree with that perspective. I think the ending of this sequence is some of the most powerful storytelling in the entire game. Firstly, I love the portrayal of Joel on his own here. It's where we see the full extent of the things he'll do when someone he cares about is on the line, and more importantly, when he's free of their judgment. The scene where he tortures two of David's men is one of my favorites, and one of the most revealing character moments in the entire game. This is the kind of man that Joel really is. He'll do anything and hurt anyone to protect those he cares about, which foreshadows what he'll do in the final moments of the story. Joel's presence in this chapter at all is actually a testament to something I talked about earlier, that being the fact that The Last of Us's reality bends to the emotions of the characters and not what's technically possible in real life. There's no way that Joel would actually be up and functional after just a couple shots of penicillin, but because it serves the high emotionality of the sequence, up he is, and playing post-apocalyptic John Wick just as effectively as if he'd never been injured. Secondly, Ellie's own characterization here demonstrates not only her resilience, but also her cleverness. I like this characterization of her a lot better than the Rambo Ellie of Left Behind, because I think it leans into the kind of character she becomes in Part 2. Ellie's a pretty wiry girl, so she's got to use guerrilla tactics and manipulation to take people out or avoid them altogether, both of which are things she's learned by watching Joel. David is presented as a cannibal in a PDF file not to exploit Ellie's gender, but to justify the violence done to him. Ellie has a protracted stealth boss fight against him that's suitably fucking creepy and then slaughters him brutally and deservedly with a machete. This is the moment that people complain about. Critics of this sequence say that Joel coming in undermines Ellie's victory here, but this moment isn't about aggrandizing Joel as a protector. It's about strengthening the relationship between the two characters and moving them from a traveling companion relationship to a father-daughter relationship. Ellie has already won here. David has been dead for at least 3 or 4 machete swings before Joel comes in. He doesn't do anything to swoop in and save her here. Instead, he's the support mechanism after the immense trauma that Ellie has just experienced. I don't think it undermines the character's strength or suggests anything sexist at all to say that after almost being chopped up by a cannibal, maybe a person might need a little bit of help to cope. Honestly, this conception of strength seems to me to be itself rooted in a sort of toxically masculine perception that strength is always about being unflappable and never accepting help. After our big ticket change, the game winds down to its final vignette, Salt Lake City, and the Firefly Hospital. You can feel the scar of the events with David throughout the entire first half of this chapter. It actually follows through on the role reversal that the Winter chapter is predicated on by continuing that role reversal in characterization. Ellie is less talkative than she's ever been, and Joel, conversely, can't fucking shut up. It's honestly kind of uncomfortable. It feels like he's basically having a conversation with himself. Even though she survived, Ellie's been forever scarred by the events of the Winter, and she'll never truly be the same again. Then there's the obvious and more controversial aspect of the final vignette, the cruel ultimatum between Ellie's life and the possibility for a cure. People tend to be very black and white about this situation, and to be fair, I think that's how the developers want it to be, but in looking at and thinking about the situation the text presents, it just isn't that cut and dry. The Fireflies are presented as being certain that sacrificing Ellie's life would lead to a cure, but I can't help but look at this situation and think that they're acting extremely rashly. Why would you just jump to killing your 1 in 7 billion case of natural immunity within a day of having her delivered? There's also the added element that, despite the fact that Ellie would likely say yes, the doctors and Fireflies don't take time to ask for her consent. Now, I'm not saying that justifies Joel slaughtering them and also ignoring Ellie's agency by taking her from the hospital while she's still unconscious, but I also don't think the Fireflies are just flatly in the right, and I don't think Joel's actions in this moment are what cements him as a truly irredeemable character. This is his trauma-fueled response, though the degree of violence he engages in is still truly monstrous. Player reactions to this moment in the game, Joel's rampage through St. Mary's Hospital, are something that I think played a massive role in inspiring the entire structure of The Last of Us Part 2. Neil Druckmann is on record saying that the role reversal of the Winter chapter was involved, but I can't help but think that this section was instrumental as well. There's a strong contingent of the fanbase that feel that Joel did absolutely nothing wrong in this scenario. I think the developers expected a lot more people to look at this situation and think, oh my god, I can't believe the love that Joel and Ellie have found for each other led to something this horrible. Instead, that process of players grafting Joel's identity onto their own was so successful that people wound up finding the situation to be at least ethically ambiguous, with some going to any lengths to justify what he did. It's worth noting that, according to Neil Druckmann in the podcast about the TV show, parents who played the game sided with Joel 100% of the time. My own father, after watching the finale of the show, that if he were in that situation and capable of that kind of action, he'd do the exact same thing in a heartbeat and wouldn't regret it. To me, it's what Joel does after the massacre that cements Joel as a horrible person and an irredeemable character. When Ellie wakes up in the back of the car, still in a surgery gown and under anesthesia, he lies about what he did. It's clear even then that she doesn't believe him. I mean, who would? There's way too many inconsistencies in his half-assed story, and he can't even sell it to himself, let alone someone else. From here, it's immediately clear that Joel hasn't actually done any healing at all throughout the course of the game. He simply feels as though he's found a replacement daughter. This action alone shows firstly that he has no true respect for Ellie or her agency as a person, and secondly, that his choice to kill the Fireflies was entirely selfishly motivated because of that lack of respect. There's no part of Joel in that moment that was thinking about the ethics of the situation, or even the basic idea that Ellie deserves to make the choice about what should happen to her. Instead, he was single-mindedly focused on making sure that he could keep this relationship that he needed to feel okay. He robs her of her decision, and then he lies about it without a second thought. I remember when I was 13 and The Last of Us initially released, I thought the ending was terrible. If you've listened to my infamous video, you know that I was an Xbox 360 gamer during my tween and early teen years, so when the game initially came out, I could only engage with it passively through Let's Plays. I saw this scene.
Right now,
Swear to me. Swear to me that everything that you said about the Fireflies is true.
I swear.
Okay.
And I thought it was a huge letdown and an anticlimax. I didn't understand how great it was until I played the game for myself, and even then, I couldn't articulate why it was so great until I revisited the game about 3 or 4 years ago. Now, re-engaging with it again in the context of postmodern theory, I have another new perspective in terms of how it engages with the rest of the game's narrative structure. The ending leverages everything that the game has built over its runtime to perfect effect. Because of the player's direct empathetic connection with both Joel and Ellie, we now identify to some extent with both of them, having played as both characters at different times, so we can completely feel both sides of this discussion. It also leverages the tropes that it's been running through to very novel effect. Instead of the heartwarming father-daughter relationship we expected to have by the end of the game, it's been subverted by Joel's deceit. It also plays into that focus on moments of change that we've been discussing, where normally there would be a button on the relationship or the story as a whole, a result of all of the relationship changes that have been building up over the course of Ellie and Joel's journey. This ending instead leverages that climax into another final moment of change that runs counter to all those that came before. This whole time, the two have been building up a bond of trust and family, and now in this one moment, with this one action on Joel's part, everything that was built is rotten to the core. Then, just like the rest of the narrative, the result is completely ignored. The final major change in the relationship has taken place, and we cut to black. The unspoken implication being that their relationship will never truly recover from this moment. It's a beautifully performed, written, and shot ending with a massive amount of emotional impact. If the story were to end right here, I would be satisfied. The Last of Us was extremely well received upon its initial release, but in recent years, some people have been turning against the title. Detractors often malign it as not being enough of a game. I feel like there's a certain movement in games over the last few years that sees a game trying to tell a story above all else as not being a valid objective. This is kind of a sister school of thought to the challenge is the only thing that matters school of thought. I can only really speak to my own perspective, but The Last of Us being an interactive story, even with its minimalist gameplay, fundamentally separates it from the experience of passive art. It may be concerned with aping the tropes and style of that passive art, but the fact remains that it is still in the end an interactive experience. It evokes emotions that a passive media experience won't, causes you to identify with its characters in a way that passive media can't. The cinematographic control allows players to create the image they find to be the most powerful. Interactivity is core to the experience of the title, and that only becomes more true in Part 2. The Last of Us Part 2 is a wildly controversial title for reasons that I understand but disagree with massively. Discussion of this game is so charged and toxic that even mentioning it on the internet will start flame wars in almost any comments section. I'm sure that even with my minuscule following, there will be people who stumble upon this video and have to comment about how much they hate this game. It seems that for some reason, The Last of Us Part 2 induces a sort of acute psychosis in a lot of people that makes them completely suspend their critical faculties. The hatred regarding this game is so fervent and vitriolic that there's even an entire subreddit with over 60,000 users dedicated explicitly to hating it. I've heard people whose opinions I respect a great deal, smart people who I know think about the media they consume, come out with some of the most brain-dead and reactionary takes regarding Part 2. I think this is why. Where the original game was a work of pastiche, heavily mired in artistic ideas that have already been explored in other mediums, the second game is far less reliant on pre-existing media and instead leans into new and uncomfortable territory artistically, that's still distinctly postmodern, but not in a way that the general public enjoys. Pastiche is the easy part of postmodernity, the comfortable part, the part that allows Hollywood studios to churn out movie after movie that restates the same basic ideas with a new coat of paint every few months. While The Last of Us Part 2 leans into pastiche at times, it's far more concerned with the end of objective narratives and what I would describe as an almost expressionist impulse, both far more deliberately uncomfortable ideas to grapple with. Expressionism was a modernist movement concerned with evoking an intense, usually negative emotional experience in its audience at any cost. Expressionist works will sacrifice realism, sensical storytelling, and, especially relevant here, audience comfort for the sake of the emotional experience they're trying to evoke. All of these sacrifices are made in The Last of Us Part 2 many times for the sake of evoking an intensely negative emotional experience in the player, which is largely what I think led to a lot of people rejecting the game. I think it's pretty obvious already, but contrary to popular, or at least vocal opinion, I absolutely love The Last of Us Part 2. It's one of the most brutally uncomfortable and depressing experiences I've ever had with a video game, and I loved every minute of it. The thing that Part 2 is most fundamentally concerned with, to my mind, is narratives. Sam talked about how postmodernity sees all narratives as fundamentally subjective. It's worth noting that the kind of narratives we're talking about here aren't strictly fictional ones, but historical ones. The real-life narratives that we tell ourselves about the world, our culture, and other cultures. The Last of Us Part 2 makes a big deal about the fact that each character's version of events is inextricably tied to their own subjective experience of them. The game hinges upon pivots in perspective that at the time of release were a secret, and when they were discovered, infuriated a massive number of people. The game tries to leverage the interactive nature of video games to make players empathize with both Ellie and Abby's narratives, but it didn't account for one fact, that being just how much players had grafted their identities onto Joel in the previous title. For those of you who don't know, The Last of Us Part 2's inciting incident is the brutal murder of the previous game's protagonist, Joel, at the hands of Abby, one of our new protagonists. It's not explained outright at the start, but it can easily be inferred that her group kills him for the choice that he made at the end of the first game. Personally, I had come into the second game assuming Joel would die. His story was done, and his character had been fully explored, so his death never really bothered me. For others, though, it was enraging. I don't think Naughty Dog had realized just how many people genuinely thought that Joel did nothing wrong at the end of the first game. I personally find his actions to be a bit more ethically murky than the game wants you to, but I certainly assumed that the wholesale slaughter of an entire hospital full of soldiers and an innocent doctor would bring some kind of retributive violence upon him. To some people, though, the degree of empathy they had created with the character of Joel throughout their journey in the first game was so powerful that they couldn't bring themselves to empathize with his killer. Even I, as someone who loves Part 2, find it pretty hard to empathize with Abby. I can't help but feel that to some extent, she brought the horrors that Ellie will wreak in her narrative on herself. The thing is, I don't even think the game necessarily disagrees with that perspective. It never frames Abby's murder of Joel as something that's good or even justified, and she suffers immensely for it. She has guilt-ridden nightmares every night. She lost most of her friends because of what she did. Hell, characters even directly tell her that she's a bad person. The only people who affirm Abby are those who are extremely biased in her favor like Owen, or weren't there for the murder of Joel in the first place. For the entire first half of the game, we're playing as the monster that she created. Ellie's actions during her 3 days in Seattle punish Abby for her crime in ways that could arguably be worse than death. Having empathy for a character isn't the same as thinking that they're a good person. Abby's whole campaign is the story of her desperately and nearly suicidally trying to kill her guilt by helping Lev and Yara. It's only through selfless, restorative actions and relationships that Abby can find any degree of redemption for what she did, and even then, the punishment she receives will stay with her as trauma forever. People want objective ways to look at a story. They want there to be a good guy and a bad guy, and in the case of The Last of Us Part 2, things are just never that simple. Part 2, in addition to its focus on narratives, has a strong focus on the folly of revenge. There's a reason the trophy for beating the game on the highest possible difficulty is called Dig 2 Graves. The whole story is an Ouroboros of revenge motivated by Joel's massacre at the end of the original game. It's fitting that Part 2 opens with a scene of Joel telling Tommy what he did in Salt Lake City. It's not so much a recap of the events of the original game. Part 2 doesn't really have any desire to draw in an audience that didn't engage with Part 1. Instead, it serves as an establishment of the fact that Joel's massacre is going to cast a shadow over the entire story to follow. Then there's the scene following that setup with Joel and Ellie. I always find this scene to be brutally uncomfortable in such a simple way. There's just this intense awkwardness between the two of them that really illustrates what I talked about in the first game's finale. That even though they aren't technically estranged yet, their relationship has been cracked at its very foundation. Less than 10 minutes in, and we're already seeing Part 2's penchant for exploring uncomfortable emotional experiences. Then of course there's the song. It's honestly so on the nose that I initially assumed the song was written for the game when I first played it. It's not, it's actually a Pearl Jam song called Future Days, but the implications of the song and its use throughout the story are both obvious and unsubtle. This isn't meant to be a dig. I know that subtlety in art is often held up on a pedestal, but it's never been something I've found to be strictly necessary. If something is emotionally effective or gets the point across, I have no problem with it being unsubtle. I'm a musician in real life, far more so than I am a writer actually, so diegetic leitmotifs like this really get to me. A big part of Ellie and Joel's bond in Part 2 is their shared love of musicianship, something that actually holds true about Baker and Johnson in real life as well. Whenever Ellie sits down with a guitar, something that happens several times in her campaign, she'll often begin by playing through the first few chords of Future Days. Guitar is part of her physical connection to her relationship with Joel, and after his murder, it's the only part of him she thinks she has left. Unsubtle? Yes. Effective? Absolutely. It's fitting for the series in general too, as the classical guitar soundtrack is integral to both titles. There's even a minigame that you can engage with at certain points that lets you play guitar, which I definitely fiddled around with for a few hours. Unsubtle and effective might as well have been the entire guiding principle of The Last of Us Part 2's development. Much has been said about the game's lack of subtlety, mostly negative, but for my money, it's a big part of what makes the game so effective. The Last of Us has never been a subtle series and is largely shaped by the emotional experience that it's trying to evoke in the audience, even in the first game. Part 2 takes that premise and ratchets it up to 11 in almost every way. There's very little in Part 2 that feels truly realistic. Around every corner there's imagery, sound design, or dialogue that may be obvious and unrealistic, but remains emotionally effective. Take for example the composition of this segment. This section is from Ellie's first day in Seattle, where the shit really starts hitting the fan. The stark red lighting in the darkness is very obviously meant to imply that as Ellie embarks on her journey into Seattle, she's descending into hell voluntarily. Yet this deeply unsubtle imagery is very effective, in that I understand the framing of the scene immediately and can then experience the carnage in the combat scene to follow in the context that the developers were trying to invoke for me. It also helps to establish visual shorthand for the lighting of future scenes, like the one where Ellie kills Abby's friend Nora. The scene is one of the most brutal and truly violent things that Ellie does in the game, and a big moment for her character development, and it's lit with this same stark red emergency lighting, evoking the same metaphor quickly and effectively. For another great example, there's this scene with the Brachiosaurus skeleton during Ellie's first flashback. The scene is pretty clearly meant to parallel the famous giraffe scene from the first game, but where once there was a living, breathing giraffe, now there's only the skeleton of something long dead. This parallel imagery serves as a pretty obvious metaphor for the relationship between Joel and Ellie. Something that was once beautiful, but has now been corrupted to the core by Joel's violence and lies. Once again, obvious, but very effective. It's when those obvious yet effective elements are applied to evoking a more explicitly negative emotional experience in the player that people start to get up in arms. The chief example of this being how the game approaches its violence. Kills in Part 2 are brutal, even by the standards of the franchise thus far. The original game wasn't cavalier about its violence in any way, and it certainly wasn't presented as something that was good or easy, but Part 2 is a lot more deliberately uncomfortable. Enemies will shriek and writhe, sometimes for multiple seconds upon being killed. The gore is far, far more explicit and rendered in disgusting detail. Even the silent takedowns are a lot more brutal and detailed, with Ellie's knife creating gushes of blood or Abby actively cracking the neck of her target. The presentation of violence is actually part of what makes me describe the game as expressionistic. Expressionist works often utilize extreme grotesque imagery as part of the emotional experience they seek to evoke. For example, Alban Berg's expressionist opera, Wojciech, revolves around the brutal murder of the titular character's partner. all of the NPCs have names and relationships with one another as well, which must have been a pretty painstaking level of detail to put into the world. They'll scream or call out to their fallen comrades when they discover a body. It's an approach to violence that I can't really think of another game taking, trying to demonstrate its effects in real time while you perpetrate it. Much has been made about how the game is trying to make you feel bad for playing it, and I have to look at this criticism and say, yeah, that's kind of the whole creative objective. Part 2 is trying to evoke a negative emotional experience in anyone who plays it. It wants you to feel hate, rage, loss, depression, and yes, guilt. I understand that's not exactly what everyone wants out of media, and in that case, maybe the game isn't for you. But that doesn't somehow make the title objectively bad. Whenever discussion of a given piece of art takes place on the internet, people are always trying to say they provide an objective analysis. Well, I'm here to tell you that's bullshit. There's no such thing as an objective analysis of a piece of art. Never has been, and never will be. Everything about how we engage with media is completely colored by our own personal preference, and there are no rules. Invoking a negative emotional experience in the audience is a perfectly valid creative objective. And while that doesn't mean you have to like it, it also doesn't mean that a work is somehow intrinsically broken or evil for pursuing it. I do think that the team should be very proud of how successful the game was in this objective too. The very fact that there was so much rage about the game trying to make you feel bad for playing it shows that it did make people uncomfortable. These people, in making this criticism, are essentially admitting that by virtue of the process of identity grafting and the way that the game presented its violence, they felt complicit in the murders that Ellie committed, and thus felt bad about it. People want to feel like they're a good person. That's why players in RPGs almost always choose the good path. And when the game made them feel like they weren't, they reacted to that feeling the way that most people do, with indignant anger. This is why The Last of Us games are so interesting to me. People will continually complain and complain about the fact that games being linear narratives that can only play out in one way is somehow regressive creatively. Yet, here these two titles are, proving that even when nothing you do will change how things play out, the very presence of interactivity at all changes how you relate to the story. After the initial introduction, there's a 5-year time skip to a chapter in Jackson that brings back something I talked about in the original game in an even bigger way. I mentioned briefly that the original game is heavily influenced by westerns, and I think that Part 2 leans into that even harder. This may be a bias on my part, because I came into my original playthrough of Part 2 immediately after playing Red Dead Redemption 2, but I feel this opening sequence and the story as a whole have deep ties to the western genre. Most obviously, the literal setting of Part 2, especially the opening sequence, is the American West. In the original game, we had a transcontinental road trip, but here we're in the Midwest or on the West Coast the entire time. This is also related to the Infected's reduced role in Part 2. The Infected are almost entirely narratively irrelevant to Part 2, serving as gameplay elements or obstacles frequently, but only being truly narratively relevant a few times. It's notable that early on in Part 2, Ellie and Dina mention their friend Eugene dying of old age, signifying that the world has begun to adapt to the infection and maybe even surpass it. It's still a danger, sure, but it's far less of one than it was even 5 years ago. Here, instead, the focus is much more on the societies that are starting to arise from the ashes of the old world, which I think is a big part of what gives the game its Western feel, this element of taming the new frontier that the CBI has created. There's even direct narrative parallels to True Grit, which also revolves around a revenge quest for the brutal murder of a father figure. And it is brutal for a few specific reasons. The duration of the Jackson prologue is one of them. Jackson is a long and largely uneventful chapter until one of the few moments where the Infected are actually truly narratively relevant. The snowstorm zombie horde which drives Abby and Joel into their fateful confrontation plays a great trick on you, putting you through a frantic and dangerous series of combat sequences and just enough time to get to know Abby a little bit and feel comfortable. The game pulls the trick that the original game tried to pull with David, only this time it works because it's been reversed. Joel and Tommy trust Abby, and we trust Tommy and Joel, so it gets our guard down just enough that Abby's abrupt betrayal, the real climax of the sequence, slaps you across the face. The gore and violence depicted in Joel's death is one of the most brutal scenes I've ever watched, not just in a video game, but any piece of media. Again, I'm no stranger to gore or intense violence, and this scene hurts me to watch every time. It's helped along significantly by the game's engine, too. Part 2's engine is capable of rendering facial details well enough that it doesn't have to utilize pre-rendered cutscenes, so there's no transition buffer between gameplay and the moment where Joel is first attacked. It's impossible for somebody who's played the first game to watch the sequence, hear Ellie's pleading screams, and not feel exactly what she's feeling in that moment, and for the rest of her campaign. Joel's death breaks something in Ellie. Even though they were estranged, she still cared about him, and there was still a bond there. One of my favorite mechanics in Part 2 is Ellie's journal, and from the moment of Joel's death onward, it's filled not with notes about day-to-day life or romantic prospects, but depressed rants and drawings. Through the journal, you can track Ellie's descent throughout her 3 days in Seattle and moving forward. During Ellie's 3 days, players will kill untold numbers of people for the sake of getting to Abby. What becomes evident over the course of the 3 days is that she's reveling in the violence, trying to kill her pain by causing it in others. Ellie's Day 2 is probably the best example of this. During the latter half, her assault on the hospital, it's the first time in her campaign that Ellie has been left on her own. The first day is spent entirely with Dina, and the first half of Day 2 with Jesse, Dina's ex-boyfriend. The moment she's on her own, Ellie begins to have lines of dialogue during her stealth kills that aren't there otherwise. She'll slit somebody's throat and hiss, with a sort of malevolent satisfaction. It's like she's letting loose when she's free of the judgment of the other characters, just like Joel did when he was trying to save Ellie in the winter chapter of the first game. There's a great parallel on Day 2 between her story and Abby's as well. When Ellie tortures and kills Nora to get Abby's location, she does so by bludgeoning her, the same way that Abby tortured and killed Joel. They're bound together now, not just by their histories, but by direct action. Ellie's pursuit only becomes more dogged every day that the team spends in Seattle, to the point where she's willing to leave Tommy behind in order to get a shot at Abby. The journal as a mechanic makes it clear, though, that none of what she's doing is actually bringing her any peace. It's an obsessive and self-destructive downward spiral, not a revenge mission. And her anger at Abby, while real, is also serving as a stand-in for all her unresolved issues with Joel and with herself. Ellie's campaign for me is the highlight of the Part 2 experience. It feels like this campaign is the part of the game that had the most clear artistic vision. Over the course of Ellie's 3 days, there's this element of the weather slowly getting worse as the storm moves in over Seattle. As she alienates each of her companions, first Dina by not turning back the moment she reveals that she's pregnant, then Jesse by trying to abandon Tommy, the world slowly becomes more and more hostile. Ellie's Day 3 has my favorite gameplay sequence in the game by far, a semi-aquatic stealth sequence trying to steal a motorboat so she can brave the raging flooded streets of Seattle. When she's finally riding out to the aquarium where Abby is supposedly holed up, the storm has gotten so bad that the bay is churning with massive waves that buffet Ellie to the point where she's thrown from her boat. It's like the world itself is trying to stop her, but even still, she swims the rest of the way, damn near drowning. As she says on Day 1,
You can't stop this.
the scene where Ellie kills Owen and Mel is a little bit more creatively disjointed than the rest of the campaign, though. Up to this point, everything Ellie has done has been of her own volition. She's actively chosen at every chance she's gotten to keep following this self-destructive path. Here, the killing of Owen and Mel is instigated by someone else. Ellie is holding them up for information, and it seems somewhat unclear whether she's planning to kill both of them or not. But either way, I don't like the fact that violence is initiated by Owen here. Firstly, it feels kind of out of character for him. Owen is the most compassionate character on the WLF's side of the story. He was openly against the killing of Joel, and he's the one who saved both Ellie and Tommy's lives from the rest of the killers. Moments before he attacks Ellie, he's trying to de-escalate the situation. My main problem here is that the fact that Owen initiates the violence takes some of the burden of the killings off of Ellie's shoulders. If I had my way, she would have seen Joel's interrogation trick through and killed both of them regardless. That way she can be truly, fully responsible for the murders. Throughout the rest of the campaign, Ellie has been the instigator, and I think that should have stayed true all the way through this scene. Then of course there's the other part of the game that's objectively bad. That being the most major pivot in perspective, switching from Ellie to Abby just before the climax of the entire Seattle story. This of course is a major break with traditional narrative structure. Ellie's campaign thus far has been its own self-contained 3-act story, literally sectioned out into 3 days. This pivot, however, is key to all of the game's thematic priorities. People often float the idea of Ellie and Abby's stories being intercut with one another, and while that structure could deliver the same story per se, it would completely change one of the game's major themes, that being the inherent subjectivity of historical narratives. Yes, this is where things all start to get a bit postmodern again. Abby's campaign is where this theme becomes relevant and serves to complement Ellie's campaign in that theme. I'm not the first person to point this out, but we're supposed to have followed Ellie's campaign all the way through because we're experiencing her subjective version of the narrative. Ellie's campaign is intercut with flashbacks of her time with Joel after they moved to Jackson, a series of 3 brief stories to illustrate how the two have become estranged. You already know what happened. Ellie found proof of the lie, and the two's relationship fell apart like it was destined to from the moment Joel said, "I swear." That is Ellie's subjective, historical context for the events taking place in Seattle. The unresolved conflict that drives her to kill and kill and kill until either she or Abby is dead, damn the cost. The game pivots here to show us that not only does Abby have a different subjective narrative of the murder of Joel and the 3 days in Seattle, but so do thousands of other people. If the two narratives were intercut, this thematic objective would be completely lost. Good writers, which I think it's pretty evident Neil Druckmann is, given how successful the first game was and how good this one is, don't subvert traditional narrative structure without a reason to do so. They know that people like traditional narratives, and that their work would be more successful if they didn't. Part 2 is not only much better for being paced this way, it's the only way it actually works in all the ways it aspires to. We're immediately thrown into Abby's first flashback rather than her first day in Seattle, as a method of grounding the entire story from Abby's perspective in the historical context of her life. The extended flashback sequence here is sort of a second prologue to give you a chance to adjust to playing as Abby before we actually have to throw ourselves into her side of the Seattle story. One of the things I love about this second prologue is how it draws parallels not only between Ellie and Abby, but also Abby and Joel. Ellie and Abby's motivations for what they've done are exactly the same. They both seek revenge for the death of a father figure, in this case Abby's biological father. There's a brief scene that I don't love that basically tries to rewrite Marlene's character as being sympathetic to Joel, which she clearly wasn't in the end of the original game. Overall though, the prologue draws a portrait of Abby's father that's a compassionate and kind-hearted man. Joel killed him in his rampage through the hospital, and immediately the scene cuts to Abby killing Joel right before Ellie's eyes. This parallel here is the one that I find to be the most fun. Joel killed Abby's father, and now she's done the exact same thing to somebody else by killing him. Nothing has been fixed here, nothing has been restored, and she knows it as soon as she's done. She's on the same path that Ellie was on during her 3 days in Seattle. She's just ahead of the curve. This is the context that brings us into Abby's first day in Seattle, presented as the aforementioned nightmares. This is what I mean when I say the game isn't presenting Abby as somebody who's in the right. It's not presenting Joel that way either, which is part of what makes players mad, but make no mistake, Abby is being punished for her crime by the story. The first day begins with a period of downtime, exploring the WLF's society, committing hard to the pacing slowdown that was introduced by the perspective shift. The game gives you a lot of time to adjust to Abby being your point of view character, and uses that time to continue exploring this theme, showing a society that on the surface really isn't that much different from and actually far more developed than Jackson. This sequence continues the unsubtle but effective school of storytelling as well, basically taking you on a tour of the children that Ellie might have orphaned during her revenge quest. I've heard people call this sequence condescending, and I really don't understand why. Clearly a lot of people do need to be reminded that violence has consequences, considering the reaction to the way that Part 2 presents it. The unintended consequences of violence is a big theme in Part 2, and this is the game making you think about those consequences. Every time you kill someone, that person had a family. Just like Dr. Anderson had a family, and Joel had a family. If you call being asked to consider the unintended consequences of your actions condescending, then my condolences go out to the people in your life. Abby's Day 1 is the day that engages the most with the theme of subjective historical narratives that I've been talking about. Certainly it's an undercurrent throughout the entire game, but here it's made most explicit through the war between the WLF and the Seraphites. Early on in Abby's first day, there's this conversation between her and 2 companion characters, Mel and Manny.
Remember when we could pass through this area without getting jumped by scars? Getting nostalgic about the truce? Easier days, huh?
Too easy. We let our guard down. and they strung up an entire squad.
That was in retaliation to us shooting those kids.
Okay, but those kids attacked our guys. What would you do?
I don't know, not riddle them with bullets?
I'd rather save our people.
Manny, they're kids. It's not their fault.
Not our fault either. Those deaths are on them.
Okay.
In this conversation, it's made clear that not only was the whole war started out of revenge, but both sides have completely different stories as to what happened, to the point that none of the actual people in the societies really know why they're fighting anymore. They're all just running on blind hatred, facilitated by the historical narrative that suits their society's purposes the best. Seattle's a city built on hatred and revenge, and Ellie is just the latest in a slurry of it. People have complained about the fact that Abby's campaign is mostly unrelated to Ellie's story. Their two plots don't really cross over with one another directly, and that's true. The connection, though, is a thematic one. Abby's 3-day campaign relates to several of the game's thematic priorities. As I've already said, the game's preoccupation with subjective historical narratives is one of them. Beyond that, though, Abby's story is largely about her attempts to help two exiled Seraphite kids, Lev and Yara. A full 2 days of Abby's story are almost completely focused on this mission, to the exclusion of almost all other major events in the city. Just like Ellie, Abby is consumed with an emotional mission rather than a strictly militant one, and her story of those 3 days isn't even the biggest historical event in that time either. Over the course of the 3 days in Seattle, the WLF plan and mount a massive assault on the Seraphites' island, which will wind up largely wiping out both groups. For the vast majority of people, this would be the major historical event of those 3 days, and yet it serves mostly as a backdrop in Abby's campaign and barely factors into Ellie's campaign at all. Their own emotional and subjective experiences of that time are more important than the war or the mutually assured destruction of both societies. Abby's second day is mostly concerned with her thematic connection to Ellie. Ellie's story was a downward spiral into revenge and murder, and Abby's story here is her learning what Ellie will learn by the end of the game. I feel that it's pretty clear that Abby's whole story is underscored by her guilt for Joel's murder. She got what she wanted and it didn't fix anything. All it did was give her nightmares. She hears Ellie's screams every night, and for what? She's alienated a massive number of people through her pursuit of Joel and her constant killing of Seraphites, and day 2 is her chance to turn her life around a little bit. To finally do something good. It kind of reminds me of Dishonored's DLC Knife of Dunwall in that way, if you've played that game or listened to my video about it. It's her relationship with Lev that ultimately offers her a chance to heal from the emotional wounds that Joel inflicted on her so long ago. Lev has perspective beyond his years due to his status as a trans Seraphite, alienating him from both societies. He and Abby slowly develop a bond of trust through their work to save Yara from a nasty broken arm gone south, and their collaboration gives Lev much needed support and Abby something positive to fight for again. The two have what's probably the first positive relationship that we've seen in the entire series, actually bringing out the best in each other rather than simply sticking together due to traumatic bonds. Lev is able to see past the hatred fostered by their societies due to his rejection from both, trusting Abby, and in turn she comes to let go of her hatred and move forward. You really get the sense that Abby has woken up from some kind of stupor. She was just going through the motions since her father died, and now at last she's finally able to move on. Abby's third day, then, is about testing the new resolve that she's found, whether her new relationship with Lev is truly more important to her than her hatred and rage. First, it tests it against the society she's left behind, and we, of course, know, in a nice little bit of dramatic irony, that it will be tested on a much more personal level before the evening's through. If Ellie's third day was my favorite chapter in the game, Abby's is easily my second favorite. It's here that the cycles of revenge and societal othering that have been festering in Seattle take on truly epic proportions with the burning of Haven, the Seraphite capital city. When Yara is killed by the WLF assault on the island and Abby is forced to choose between Lev and the military dictatorship she hails from, she chooses Lev in a heartbeat. It's not even close. It's interesting how the game leverages its presentation of violence here, using gameplay to make you feel the weight of the choice. Before, you'd been killing people who cared for each other but didn't know you. Here, the enemies from the WLF all know Abby. She's one of their military's best and brightest, and so there's a real feeling that you're committing a betrayal here, even if it's a justified one. These people trusted you. maybe even admired you, and now it's your paramount objective to put lead between each other's eyes. The horse ride from one side of the city to the docks is the best sequence in Abby's whole campaign. There's a full-scale battle happening between the WLF and the Seraphites, and after everything you've learned about both societies, you're not sad to see them die. The Seraphites are hypocritical cultists who disembowel people as punishment and engage in child marriage, and the WLF, while seemingly mimicking the best of the old world, are essentially a genocidal military dictatorship. Here in Haven, their mutual hatred boils over into a level of chaos that honestly puts the Outbreak Day sequence from the original game to shame. Much like in Ellie's last day, it feels like the world has gone to hell around Abby and Lev, only now that chaos is protecting them from the violence surrounding them as they make their mad dash to the port. It's truly frantic, genuinely stressful, and it features one of the most brutal mini-bosses ever, with the giant sickle-wielding man who tries to stop the pair as they steal the boat back to the mainland. Then comes the real test. We already know that when Abby returns to the aquarium, she'll be greeted by the cold, dead eyes of Owen and Mel, killed by Ellie while she was saving Lev's life. Here, she immediately gives in to her hatred again. It's like the growth we've seen in Abby over the last 3 days is eroded away with this one act on Ellie's part. The cycle is starting all over again, bringing the story full circle to Ellie and Abby's confrontation. Just like was the case with the original game's ending, this fight capitalizes on everything that the game has set up so far. You've been thoroughly bonded to both of these characters through gameplay, so we reach this duel where I can honestly say that I didn't want either party to win. We have the benefit of experiencing both of these characters' subjective interpretations of the same motivating event, and there's no objective narrative as to which party is correct. There's even some great moments of blurred player perspective utilizing QTEs. In The Last of Us, button-mashing QTEs are usually a way of illustrating the player character trying to break a grapple or resist some kind of attack. They're almost never used offensively. Several times during the fight, Abby will grab Ellie and the button mash will start, but your mind kind of gets blurred between whether you're mashing the button to help Ellie break out or help Abby kill her for this exact reason. The fight is tough, too. I died more times in Ellie's boss fight than I think I did at any other point in the game. It's a great sort of puzzle boss where you have to beat Ellie's guerrilla tactics through clever play rather than a straight-up fight. The only reason Ellie and Dina survive is Abby's relationship with Lev, and even then it's by the skin of their teeth. Abby damn near perpetuates the cycle again, and undoes all the progress she's made, but Lev manages to pull the snake's tail out of its mouth at the last second. I think it's important to note that nothing about the way this whole fight or scene is framed puts Abby above Ellie here. The whole scene is lit with the same red emergency lights that have signified the descent into hell throughout Ellie's campaign, suggesting that Abby hasn't risen above Ellie here at all. The two of them are just as bad as each other, reveling in a blood feud that has no particular end in sight. Dina and Lev are the ones who are in the right, the former just trying to protect somebody she loves, and the latter stopping Abby from giving in to her worst self, the self that comes easiest to her. People have complained about the game trying to make Abby out as the good guy, and I really don't think that happens until the very end of the game, when she truly is in the right. Part 2's epilogue is one of its most universally criticized portions, and again, as with most common criticisms of the game, I really couldn't disagree more. Ellie's character arc diverges from Abby's here, and I think it's important that the game explore that. Up to this point, the two characters have been following the same path, but now Ellie has one key difference. Her revenge went unfulfilled. She's done so many wrongs, and now she's been forced to return to Jackson with her tail between her legs, and a huge load of trauma. Ellie is lucky in that she already has what Abby didn't. Her healing relationship is Dina. The two of them are good for each other, but there's still that undercurrent in Ellie's every thought that she failed, and Joel went unavenged. The epilogue is the part of the game where I think its expressionist inclinations are most prominent. It presents Ellie having a PTSD flashback in a really harrowing and resonant way, and then proceeds to sacrifice realism to continue dragging out that negative emotional experience. Somehow, Tommy catches wind of Abby traveling to Santa Monica. There's absolutely no way this would ever actually realistically happen in the game's world, but for Ellie's character arc to be fulfilled, and for the game to reach its final emotional climax, the two must find each other once again. When Ellie leaves to go kill Abby for the second time, it's her most self-destructive choice to this point, and I think it draws upon her previous characterization from the first game in an interesting way. When I watch the scene of Ellie leaving her farmstead, I can't help but think of this scene from the original game.
We don't have to do this. You know that, right?
What's the other option?
Go back to Tommy's. Just be done with this whole damn thing.
After all we've been through. Everything that I've done. It can't be for nothing.
This exact same drive is coming back again here. She knows that pursuing Abby isn't the right or even reasonable course of action for her in any world, but after everything she's done, all the murders in Seattle, the deaths of Owen and Mel, it can't be for nothing. For the most part, the Santa Monica chapter is just a run-up to finding Abby, killing the slavers who captured her on the way. Abby being captured by the slavers is, I think, mostly a plot device to put her on a physical level closer to Ellie's. I can't really think of any specific thematic or narrative utility they have other than that. In Seattle, the two were so unevenly matched physically that they couldn't have a real confrontation before. Now, Abby is just as shriveled and wiry as Ellie is. What happens here after Ellie frees Abby and Lev from their crucifixion is almost universally agreed upon as being the worst part of the game, and as is in fashion with the rest of my experience in the game, I feel almost exactly the opposite. After the three get to the two motorboats away from the slave compound, Ellie holds Lev at knife point and forces Abby into another fight. People have called this moment gratuitous, tasteless, comic, and even out of character for Ellie, all of which are sentiments that I think are wrong. I'll try to explain why I love this final fight so much. If Ellie lets Abby and Lev go free, there's redemption there for her. Some hope for absolution. Abby's murder has been inscribed into Ellie's identity at this point, that it can't be for nothing mentality. It makes me think of a quote from one of my favorite political streamers who said something along the lines of, "I used to believe there was a right combination of words that could be used to talk anyone out of any position, but I've learned that isn't the case." When she holds the knife to Lev's throat, there's no right combination of words that will talk Ellie down. Her lashing out here is irrational and has long since lost its original purpose. The fight that ensues is the first moment that made me feel that Part 2 has an expressionist bent. A grotesque and maximalistic fight designed to evoke Ellie's own pain in the audience. Realism and logic aren't what matter here, it's the emotion that matters. The violent rage, the self-hatred, and eventually the final realization that no amount of violence will fill the hole in Ellie's heart that Joel's death left there. In order for Ellie to let go of her revengeance, I almost said. In order for Ellie to let go of her vengeance, she had to have the opportunity to exact it and realize how empty she still felt, even on the cusp of her success. This is her true lowest point, and upon reaching it, the game's arc for her is finally complete. There's no hiding from the fact that this is her fault. She sought it out. She left behind everyone she loves, and she threatened the one person who saved her life, all for nothing. It's a deeply despondent ending for a game that's centered on experiencing negative emotion. And the image of Ellie sitting alone in the fog with nothing left but a boat and 8 fingers is an unforgettable moment for me. Something that's stuck with me precisely because of the fight that precedes it, not in spite of it. My only real problem with the fight is that you can lose. When you can die in that confrontation, it sets you back and starts to detract from the emotionality of the scene. This fight really should have been a pseudo-scripted sequence that you play through, where no matter how hard you try, you can't really die. That way, the emotionality of the scene would be preserved without any chance for the player to fuck things up and get taken out of the experience. The final scene leans into the game's preoccupation with subjective historical narratives to heartbreaking effect. Ellie's impaired playing of the Future Days theme introduces a final memory of the last time she saw Joel. The night before he was killed, when the two had just begun to start trying to reconcile. The faintest hope of their relationship healing was starting to present itself, and Abby took that from them. This unfinished business is what's been motivating everything, and it completely changed the way I viewed Ellie's actions. It didn't justify the worst of them, but I understood them beyond just my identifying with her as the protagonist. If the same thing had happened to me, I might have thrown everything away to get the person responsible too. She had just as much of a reason to go after Abby as Abby had to go after her, and now that she's put her revenge to bed, she can finally begin the journey that Abby went on during her 3 days in Seattle. When you see Ellie walking away out the window, that's the implication to me. She's moving on, from Joel, from her revenge, and from everyone at Jackson to get a fresh start and find a way to heal. It's a perfect way to end a wildly depressing game. There's still no real word on whether there'll be a Last of Us Part 3. I wasn't sure if it would happen at all for a while due to the controversy and vitriol surrounding Part 2's release. I don't think pretty much any of the controversy is warranted, and if you've either avoided the game because of bad hearsay or didn't like it upon its initial release, I strongly recommend revisiting it now 4 years later. Now that the conversation around it has calmed down and the internet hate mob isn't blaring in your ear, I think you'll look upon the game a lot more favorably. I certainly did, and I already liked the damn thing. This replay shot the game from being one that I thought was good to a title that I would describe as one of my favorites. Thankfully, I'm now much more optimistic about the possibility of a Part 3, and that's in large part thanks to the TV series. When I first saw that the Last of Us TV series was finally releasing this year on HBO Max, I wasn't even gonna watch it. I felt similarly about The Last of Us Part 1, a port of the original game to PS5 and PC using Part 2's engine. I had basically zero interest in it, having already experienced the game multiple times, but was pulled into watching the first episode when I stumbled upon my dad watching it. I was expecting, as is customary for passive media adaptations of games, a shoddy product that barely resembled the source material. Instead, I was shocked to find that not only was the material being taken seriously by the TV series, but the entire first episode was essentially an extremely faithful adaptation of the game's prologue. This first episode was enough for me to decide to give the TV series a shot, and ultimately I came away from it with very mixed feelings, which I intend to dissect here. Before we get into the discussion about how I feel about the actual show, though, I want to talk a little bit about the cultural phenomenon that surrounded it. This is the first time that I can think of that a video game has been adapted into a passive medium with any degree of success, which doesn't really surprise me. The Last of Us, especially Part 1, is heavily mired in the conventions of prestige television, and its minimalist gameplay is quite easy to remove from the experience. I remember my dad saying something along the lines of, "It must have been pretty hard to adapt this from the game," and I could only reply with, "Not really, it's basically just the game but with the gameplay sections cut out." If there's any game I would expect to be able to make the transition from active to passive media, it would be this one. What I didn't expect, however, was for the series to become a massive cultural phenomenon to the extent that it did. I saw throngs of people on my varied social media feeds that I could guarantee you had never even heard of the game before watching this series, buzzing about it. This is a good thing. I'm glad there are more people out there enjoying the thing I enjoy. However, I couldn't help but feel a little bit of the gatekeeper pop up in my mind. There's a certain primal nerd rage that I think all people feel when seeing people engage with a new adaptation of something they loved before. A real "I was here first" mentality. While this is a foolish impulse, I couldn't help but feel it to a certain extent. Part of me hated the fact that a massive number of people engaging with this show have never and will never give this story the time of day in its original form, simply by virtue of the fact that it's a video game, and video games are not considered a legitimate artistic medium. I had always thought that the perception of gaming as a medium had been ameliorating over the last several years, and was hoping this TV series would help with that process. From what I can tell, though, it did anything but that. The overwhelming feeling that I got from the conversation surrounding the show was, "I can't believe this came from a video game," which really soured my feelings towards it. It didn't help that all of the behind-the-scenes video and debrief podcasts essentially sold the game down the river. All conversation surrounding the TV series seemed to be screaming that this was the real and inherently superior Last of Us experience, and I really can't agree with that perspective. I don't mean this to say that the TV series is bad or poorly adapted, in fact, far from it. The TV series is extremely faithful to the source material, but not to a fault. They brought in members of the original game's cast and creative team for various positions and cameos. Our two leads, Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey, are excellently cast. Their portrayals of Joel and Ellie are so accurate to the original game that I was stunned to hear they were actually under explicit orders not to play it. It's honestly kind of scary how well the two capture the characters in a way that's just different enough that it doesn't feel like an imitation of Baker and Johnson's performances, but so similar that the scenes adapted directly from the game's cutscenes maintain the exact same mood and feeling. There are a lot of those scenes too. Pretty much every scene from the original game that was really iconic has been adapted directly into the TV series with striking fidelity. I say this because I need you all to understand that this section is going to sound like I don't like the TV show, and that isn't true. I'm going to be focusing on my criticisms of the TV series because all I've seen of it is praise, and I want to give voice to some of the criticisms that I do have. The show is well adapted and well made, I'm not disputing that. Just trying to analyze how it felt watching the series for me personally, and what I think was lost in the transition from an active medium to a passive one. Just like the remake of the original game that released alongside it, and the original game itself, the show's very existence is leaning into the postmodern obsession with repackaging of old ideas. But this time, that new packaging is fundamentally missing something that existed in the original game. That being interactivity. The removal of interactivity from the Last of Us experience has been made light of by many people who've talked about the TV series. It's a common sentiment that the game is basically already an interactive TV show, so it's better now that it's just a TV show. As I'm sure you're all well aware at this point in the video, I think this sentiment misses just how important even the slight degree of interactivity that the two Last of Us games featured was. Watching the TV series as somebody who loves the game, I couldn't help but feel that there was something missing from a lot of the series' runtime. That's because there was something missing: the identity grafting effect. Now, for people who've never played the game at all, this isn't going to present as an issue. The TV series is designed as a TV series, and it tells the story through those conventions. Specifically coming to the show as a fan of the game, though, I felt the absence of the original game's interactive elements a great deal. The loss of interactivity also cuts out a lot of the smaller points of detail that were drawn out during the game's sections of downtime, the smaller moments of character development and world building that I talked about so long ago. In addition, having experienced the best combat and stealth sequences in the game, the show could never make my heart pound or my adrenaline pump in quite the same way. The TV show tries to account for the fact that it can't put you in Joel's shoes by leveraging the medium of television to explore more perspectives, and when this works, it produces the best episode in the show. But when it doesn't, which I think is more often the case, it makes the 15-hour game somehow feel like a tighter experience than the 10-hour TV series. Much has been said about how great the third episode of the TV series is, and I wholeheartedly agree with all of it. The story is beautiful and an excellent divergence from the canon of the games, turning Bill into less of a tragic character and more of an aspirational one. This is one of the few places where the TV show actually subverts the pastiche of the original game, and it's remarkably effective, giving people who played the games a wonderful alternate story that doesn't hurt the canon in any way and genuinely does improve upon the original story, by leveraging the medium of television to explore another character's story in a way that expands upon the story's themes. The original game never really took the time to show healthy relationships. That mission was left to part 2, so taking some time to do that here in the TV show is actually a great idea. It's in the Kansas City arc where the TV show starts to feel more bloated than the original game's experience. Kansas City is the show's proxy for Pittsburgh, and all the events in Pittsburgh take place here. Most of the changes made are superficial. Sam is portrayed as deaf now, which is a win for disability representation and doesn't hurt the story. Cool. What's less cool is the fact that the focus on Joel and Ellie's relationship in this arc is reduced by splitting narrative focus between them and the militia that control the city. Pittsburgh was an important flashpoint for Joel and Ellie in the game because it believably portrayed their development into a team by putting them under intense, deadly pressure. There wasn't much focus given to the group of raiders that was attacking them because the story is about their relationship and their development. The show introduces a new character, Kathleen, who leads the group of revolutionaries, and this added plotline splits what could have probably been one much tighter episode into 2. It doesn't help that I don't find her to be a particularly compelling antagonist, but my main critique here is the loss of focus on the central relationship and themes. Kathleen's story isn't particularly thematically relevant to the story, or at least not in any way that won't be explored better in part 2, and so she feels like a largely unnecessary addition. The show also makes a number of seemingly superficial changes to the story that I feel defang some of the implications about Joel as a character. The original game makes it pretty clear that Joel's not a good guy, and shows that in its text. He's a dangerous person, and people who know him act like it. I've seen people say that his motivation at the beginning of the story being related to his loss of contact with Tommy is a strict improvement to the story, and I'd like to provide a counter perspective here. Tommy's estrangement from Joel in the game said something powerful about what kind of person Joel is and how bad the things he must have done were. When Tommy says this,
"Took care, that's what you call it? I got nothing but nightmares from those years.
You survived because of me.
It wasn't worth it."
I believe him because he and Joel weren't even on speaking terms before this meeting. The show tries to make a similar beat work, but it's significantly less effective, because the two were seemingly in regular contact until recently. Tommy didn't cut Joel off, which to me defangs the implications about their time after the outbreak a lot. It's a change that seems superficial, but actually has significant ramifications on the portrayal of Joel's character. There's a similar moment in the Kansas City episodes. In the game, when they see the injured man in Pittsburgh, Ellie asks Joel if they're gonna help, and Joel says,
What about the guy?
He ain't even hurt.
whereas in the TV series he just says,
Put your seatbelt on.
Are we gonna help him?
No.
Again, this seems like a really minute change, but there's a specific implication of prior knowledge through experience that the line from the game offers, which is lost in the TV show. Changes like this feel like they were just made for the sake of it, and detracted from my experience of the story by accidentally removing parts of Joel's characterization that I liked a lot. I mentioned in my section on Left Behind that I was going to get to a white whale of mine in modern artistic criticism, and I want to pull that idea back off the shelf now. I find that there's a certain selective obsession with realism, especially in prestige popular culture, that crops up in the Last of Us TV series. I mentioned in my discussion of both games that neither of those titles are particularly realistic in what they present, and how that works because those stories are driven by the emotions and relationships of the characters. The best example of this selective attention to realism is the way that the show handles Joel's injury. In my discussion of the original game, I talked about how effective the moment of Joel being impaled on the rebar spike was. That moment creates a great and powerful image. Compare this scene to the scene from the TV show, which decides to take a much more realistic approach. Now, of course, there's no accounting for taste, but this scene with the baseball bat is significantly less effective. It's missing that feeling of visceral brutality that the scene from the original game has, that makes me cringe every time I watch it. The sudden attention to realism has been made less effective, and for no real good reason. The moment the show needs to suspend realism again, it does. In the winter episodes, Joel gets back up as though he was never hurt, just like he did in the original game when the script calls for it. Selective attention to realism like this is a common crutch that film and TV adaptations use as a method of portraying themselves as more serious than their original source material. The Nolan Batman films did this too, and for my money, it's the worst aspect of that trilogy, and it often holds those movies back. I feel the same way about it here in the Last of Us TV series. The show also makes one more change that I really dislike. It explains Ellie's immunity. This might be my least favorite change the TV show made to the source material. It has a real midichlorians feel. The beginning of the final episode is devoted to this goal, and I really don't see what it adds to the story. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that it actively detracts from it. In a way, the decision to explain Ellie's immunity wraps up all of my critiques of the show into one. It's an unnecessary scene that tries to fix something that wasn't even a problem in the original story, which unintentionally removes an aspect of the original story that made it work in the first place, while detracting from the show's overall pacing. Leaving Ellie's immunity unexplained was the whole thing that motivated the Fireflies to kill her. In the show, Marlene even knows why Ellie's immune. She's there shortly after her birth, and it's pretty clear that she doesn't buy that the baby was born before Anna was bitten. Now Ellie's immunity can theoretically be reproduced, even if she wasn't involved. When she was the only known case of immunity and there was no explanation as to why, the stakes were higher. This choice not only explains something that didn't really need explaining, but does so in a way that seriously damages the stakes of the story's climax. I've griped and nitpicked enough over the show, so by now you might be asking what's really the point here, and to that I have to answer that there really isn't one. When it comes down to it, these are criticisms that I'm making of a show that is, as an overall product, a very strong adaptation. And while I may bitch and moan about changes that I didn't particularly like or selective attention to realism, none of that changes the fact that most people love this show. Hell, even for all of my criticisms, I still liked it. I just felt like it was fundamentally missing the aspect of the original game that made it special as a piece of media. The interactive nature of video games isn't something you can just remove from the experience without fundamentally shifting the way you relate to the narrative. When I look at The Last of Us TV series, all I see is a pastiche of a pastiche that really isn't adding much of anything novel to the ideas it's repackaging, outside of one episode and maybe a few other moments. It's certainly a nice repackaging, but not one that I feel makes the experience tangibly better. I think that's the main reason why people talk about the third episode so much. It's the only time the show really leverages its medium to change the story in a good way and present something truly new. Sure, a lot of people love The Last of Us TV show, and I'll probably watch the next season just like everyone else, but it'll never be my favorite way to experience the story. Luckily enough, a new adaptation doesn't take away the version of The Last of Us experience that I do really love. Just like the game existing doesn't take anything away from the people who prefer the TV show. But as somebody who does deeply prefer the game, all I can really say to people who ignore it because of its medium is that they're missing out. Thanks for listening, and come back again soon. As is customary, I'd like to take a moment to give some thanks and discuss what's coming next for the channel. Firstly, thank you to my collaborator on this video, my dear friend Sam. Sam has been a collaborator in this process, not only as a musician and theoretical consultant, but also somebody who I've constantly bandied ideas back and forth with. So my heartfelt thanks go out to you, Sam. Secondly, if you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much. As I'm writing this, I'm not sure how long this video will be, but my estimates are it'll be between 2 and 3 hours long, so thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed and that you'll like, subscribe, and ring the bell to keep hearing from me. To those of you who followed my work before, thank you for coming back and thank you for your patience. This video wound up taking way longer than I expected for several reasons. It's my first time trying to use a theoretical text in one of these videos, so that took up a lot more time than I expected. As always, I'm not an expert, and I welcome well-informed, polite corrections and expansions in the comments. I was also involved in a show during April and May which took a great deal of my time. I decided I'd rather upload less frequently but make sure I'm releasing a better product than rigidly stick to deadlines. My next project regarding Mirror's Edge should be significantly shorter and easier to produce. Thank you again for listening, and catch you later. Oh, and anyway, here's Wonderwall. Today is gonna be the day that they're gonna throw it back to you. And by now you should have somehow realized what you got to do. I don't believe that anybody feels the way I do about you now. Backbeat, the word is on the street that the fire in your heart is out. I'm sure you heard it all before, but you never really had a doubt. I don't believe that anybody feels the way I do about you now. And all the roads we have to walk are winding, and all the lights that lead me there are blinding. There are many things that I would like to say to you, but I don't know how. Because maybe you're gonna be the one that saves me. And after all, you're my wonder wall. 2, 3, Today was gonna be the day, but they'll never throw it back to you. And by now you should have somehow realized what you're not to do. I don't believe that anybody feels the way I do about you now. And all the roads that lead you there were winding, and all the lights that lead the way are blinding. There are many things that I would like to say to you, but I don't know how. I said maybe you're gonna be the one that saves me. And after all, you're my wonder wall. I said maybe you're gonna be the one that saves me. And after all, you're my wonder wall. Because maybe you're gonna be the one that saves me. You're gonna be the one that saves me. You're gonna be the one that saves me. You're gonna be the one that saves me.